Welcome to Mindful Moments. Nurse your mind on the go. This audio uses AI narration to present our original book analysis, and today we're diving deep into Paul Johnson's A History of Christianity. Buckle up as we trace Christianity's journey, from its humble beginnings as a Jewish sect to the global force it is today. We'll uncover some surprising twists, explore pivotal events, and most importantly, consider what it all means for you.
It is a sweeping narrative. What's impressive is how Johnson weaves in those complexities and controversies, those human stories that make history come alive. You won't find a dry timeline here.
Absolutely. Right from the start, I was struck by that intricate relationship between early Christianity and Judaism. It wasn't a clean break. Johnson really highlights those early challenges: circumcision, Jewish law, as major hurdles for Gentile converts.
Oh yeah, trying to convince someone from a completely different culture to embrace a faith with such specific requirements. And then just to add another layer, we need to remember that Judaism at the time of Jesus wasn't a monolith. There were various sects, like the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, each with their own interpretation of faith, making for a very complex tapestry of responses to Jesus and his teachings.
So it wasn't a simple us versus them situation.
Not at all. And that's where the figure of John the Baptist becomes so interesting. Johnson suggests he acted as a bridge, carrying certain Essene doctrines to a wider audience, almost setting the stage for Jesus.
That's a fascinating connection. It adds a whole new dimension to understanding the context. And when we talk about Jesus, Johnson emphasizes that the core conflict wasn't solely about Jewish ethics, but about Jesus' claim of divinity and his reinterpretation of God.
Right. That's a key point. This is where Christianity begins to step beyond a purely Jewish framework. Jesus' claims resonated with the Hellenistic world, where the idea of a God becoming human wasn't so alien.
Makes sense. So this sets us up for another pivotal figure, Paul. His mission to spread the word beyond Jewish circles was monumental in shaping Christianity as we know it.
Absolutely. Paul's Hellenistic approach, while hugely successful in attracting Gentile converts, also sparked tension with the more traditional Jerusalem church. His focus on the death and resurrection of Jesus as central to salvation was a significant shift away from the early Jewish Christian emphasis on Jesus' teachings and earthly ministry. We almost see two branches of Christianity forming, one rooted in the Jewish tradition, centered in Jerusalem, the other, Paul's vision, spreading rapidly among Gentiles.
And then, of course, the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. completely changes the landscape.
It's a turning point. With the Jewish Christian tradition largely extinguished, Paul's version of Christianity becomes the dominant force. But even then, the early church was far from unified. Johnson paints a picture of a multitude of beliefs and practices. He even calls it a collection of heterodoxies, highlighting the diversity of thought and interpretation that characterized this era.
So how did the church go from this state of diverse beliefs to the structured institution we recognize today?
That's where the establishment of church structure and orthodoxy comes in. Figures like Ignatius of Antioch, who emphasized bishops and apostolic succession, were instrumental in shaping a hierarchical church, establishing the very foundation of what we know as the Catholic Church.
So this is where we begin to see the seeds of the familiar Catholic Church, with its emphasis on bishops as successors to the apostles and a more centralized authority.
Exactly. And the fight against Gnosticism, a movement offering alternative interpretations of Christian teachings, further solidified the need to define boundaries and establish a clear orthodoxy. You could almost think of it as creating a rule book for Christian belief.
A rule book that ultimately leads to the formation of the New Testament.
Precisely. And this brings us to Constantine and the rise of the imperial church, a turning point with repercussions that echo even today.
This is where things get really interesting. Constantine's embrace of Christianity, culminating in the Edict of Milan in 313 A.D., elevates a persecuted sect to the favored religion of the Roman Empire. What a dramatic shift.
And what's often overlooked is that Constantine's motives weren't necessarily purely spiritual. He saw in Christianity a powerful unifying force, an organized structure that could bolster his vast empire. This wasn't just a personal conversion, but a strategic alliance between church and state.
It's almost like a political partnership with benefits for both sides. And this alliance had lasting consequences. We see the church gain wealth, influence, and a voice in political matters. The lines between church and state begin to blur. Even the emperor starts to get involved in shaping church doctrine, as he tries to promote a unified, inclusive church that reflects the harmony he envisions for his empire.
Exactly. A great example of this is the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, convened by Constantine himself. He needed to settle the divisive debate about the nature of Christ, his goal, a unified church, free of theological disputes, the Council's pronouncements on the Trinity, defining Christian orthodoxy for centuries to come, really highlight how deeply intertwined religion and politics had become.
It's mind-blowing how, in just a few centuries, Christianity went from a small, persecuted sect to the official religion of the Roman Empire, complete with a hierarchy, a defined doctrine, and an increasingly influential clergy. It really makes you wonder about the forces that drive such monumental shifts in human history.
And as we move into the Middle Ages, we see this tension between Christianity's spiritual ideals and worldly power play out in some fascinating ways. One of the most striking developments of this era is the rise of monasticism. Johnson traces it back to those early ascetics in the East, individuals who sought spiritual purification through solitude and self-denial.
It's amazing how this movement that began with solitary hermits in the deserts of Egypt and Syria eventually spreads throughout Europe, reshaping the social and religious landscape.
Yeah, Johnson describes the different forms monastic life took. From hermits to communal living in monasteries, he points out how Celtic monasticism, with its focus on scholarship, uniquely integrated itself into existing tribal structures.
The description of those Irish monasteries, like Skellig Michael perched on a remote island off the coast of Ireland, really captured my imagination. To think those monks were willing to go to such extremes, to live a life devoted to spiritual isolation.
And yet these monasteries weren't just isolated retreats. They became vital centers of learning, agriculture, and knowledge preservation during the early Middle Ages.
It's like they were islands of stability and learning, in a world often characterized by chaos and instability.
Precisely. And the Benedictine rule in the 6th century further amplified the impact of monasticism. Benedict's emphasis on order, discipline, and communal living provided a framework for monasteries to become even more influential. Johnson really emphasizes the essential role monasteries played in shaping medieval society.
They were almost like the backbone of civilization in many ways. But as we shift our focus to the papacy, we see another side of Christianity's relationship with power emerge. This time it's a struggle between the church and secular rulers. Johnson traces the evolution of papal ideology, from the concept of tetrarch supremacy to the bolder assertions of figures like Gregory VII.
Gregory VII, who was pope from 1073 to 1085, really embodies this power struggle. His insistence on papal authority over secular rulers, especially in the investiture controversy, was a major turning point.
For those unfamiliar, the investiture controversy was essentially a battle over who got to appoint bishops, the pope or secular rulers like kings and emperors. This conflict raged for decades.
It perfectly illustrates the papacy's efforts to assert its authority against increasingly powerful monarchs. The rise of national monarchies only intensified this tension, leading to conflicts like those between the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire.
It seems like the unity of Christendom, which had seemed so solid in the early Middle Ages, was beginning to crack under the pressure.
Exactly. And these cracks would widen dramatically in the 16th century with the Reformation. Johnson unpacks the factors that contributed to this upheaval, including widespread criticism of church abuses, the rise of humanism and the rediscovery of ancient texts, and the revolutionary impact of the printing press in spreading new ideas.
The Reformation truly was an earthquake. That shook the foundations of the Western Church. Figures like Martin Luther and John Calvin challenged the authority of the Pope, calling for a return to what they saw as the true teachings of the Bible. It's incredible how a movement sparked by a German monk nailing his 95 Theses to a church door could reshape the religious and political landscape of Europe.
And it's important to remember the role of humanism in setting the stage for the Reformation. Thinkers like Erasmus, while remaining within the Catholic Church, emphasized individual conscience, critical thinking, and a return to the original sources of Christianity. Their ideas fostered a climate of intellectual questioning. That made Luther's challenge all the more potent.
And let's not forget the technological innovation that played a key role. The printing press, its invention in the mid-15th century, allowed for the rapid spread of Luther's ideas, fueling the Reformation across Europe.
The Reformation wasn't simply a theological dispute. It had profound political and social consequences. It led to religious wars, the birth of new denominations like Lutheranism and Calvinism, and the continued rise of the nation-state, further challenging the universal authority of the Church.
And of course, the Catholic Church didn't just stand by passively. The Counter-Reformation launched in the mid-16th century, aimed to reform the Church internally while also combating the spread of Protestantism.
The Council of Trent, which met intermittently from 1545 to 1563, was crucial in defining Catholic doctrine and addressing some of the abuses that had fueled the Reformation. It was a period of intense theological debate and a battle for the souls of Europe.
The newly formed Jesuits, founded by Ignatius of Loyola in 1540, became the vanguards of the Counter-Reformation. They played a significant role in education, missionary work, and the fight against Protestantism. It was a period of intense religious fervor and conflict, with events like the French Wars of Religion and the devastating 30 Years' War leaving their mark on history.
As we transition to the modern era, we see Christianity continuing to adapt and grapple with new challenges. The Enlightenment, with its focus on reason and individual liberty, presented a fresh set of questions for traditional religious authority.
Thinkers like John Locke advocated for religious tolerance and the separation of church and state, ideas that had a profound influence on the development of Western societies.
And the rise of secularism, especially in Europe, led to a decline in traditional religious belief and practice among some segments of society. But even as older forms of Christianity faced these new challenges, new movements emerged, often with a more personal and emotional approach to faith.
The birth of movements like evangelicalism and Pentecostalism highlights Christianity's remarkable ability to adapt and find new expressions in a changing world.
Absolutely. And this brings us to the 20th century, an era marked by unprecedented challenges but also remarkable resilience for the Christian faith. The two world wars, the rise of totalitarian ideologies like communism and Nazism, and the continued advance of secularism created a turbulent and often hostile environment for Christianity. But despite these trials, Christianity proved capable of not just enduring, but thriving in certain contexts.
We see this in the emergence of figures like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian who resisted the Nazi regime, and Pope John X III, who convened the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, seeking to revitalize the Catholic Church.
The Second Vatican Council was a watershed moment in Catholic history, leading to significant changes in liturgy, a greater focus on ecumenical outreach, and a renewed engagement with the modern world. It was a bold effort to make Catholicism more relevant and accessible in a rapidly changing society.
Even as the traditional centers of Christianity in Europe saw a decline in religious practice, the faith continued to flourish in other parts of the world, particularly in Africa, Asia, and Latin America.
The rise of Pentecostalism, with its focus on spiritual experience and charismatic leadership, has been a driving force behind this global growth. As we conclude this part of our exploration, it's clear that Christianity is not a static, monolithic entity. It's a dynamic tradition that has continuously evolved, adapting to new challenges and finding diverse expressions across cultures and continents.
It's a story of survival in the face of persecution, of evolving power dynamics, and an enduring capacity to shape human lives and societies. We see this intricate dance between faith and reason, between spiritual ideals and earthly power dynamics, play out across centuries. And as we move on to the final part of our deep dive, we'll delve into the key takeaways from Johnson's comprehensive history, exploring those complex relationships and the enduring challenges of interpreting and applying Christian teachings in our ever-changing world. You know, as we wrap up our deep dive into Paul Johnson's A History of Christianity, I'm struck by how throughout the centuries, the story of Christianity is intertwined with the complexities of power.
Yeah, it's a theme that runs through the entire narrative, wouldn't you say? From those early days of Roman persecution to the later fusion of church and state under Constantine, power dynamics have always been central to the Christian story.
And it's not just about political power either. We see the church accumulating wealth and influence throughout the Middle Ages, the papacy vying for supremacy with secular rulers, and religious authority being used to enforce orthodoxy and silence dissenting voices. It's a recurring tension between the spiritual ideals of Christianity, with its emphasis on humility and service, and the very human desire for power and control.
Right. Johnson doesn't shy away from exploring this tension at all. He brings to light the abuses of power, the corruption, the often brutal methods used to maintain control. Think of the Inquisition, for example, a stark reminder that even a religion founded on love and compassion can be twisted and used for oppressive purposes.
It's a sobering thought. But Johnson also acknowledges the positive contributions of the church's involvement in power. The church played a crucial role in preserving knowledge and culture during the Dark Ages, providing education, establishing hospitals, supporting charitable works.
It's a complex legacy, a balance sheet with both credits and debits. Christianity's relationship with power has produced both great good and terrible evil throughout history. And this kind of leads us to another key theme that emerges from Johnson's work: the ongoing struggle to reconcile faith and reason.
It's a theme that resonates even today. How do we reconcile the claims of faith based on belief and revelation with the demands of reason and critical thinking?
Exactly. We see this tension throughout Christian history, from the early church fathers who attempted to integrate Greek philosophy with Christian theology, to figures like Thomas Aquinas, who strove to synthesize faith and reason in his Summa Theologica, to the challenges posed by the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and empirical observation. This dance between faith and reason continues.
It's like they're partners in a dance, sometimes moving in perfect harmony, sometimes stepping on each other's toes.
A perfect analogy, and this dance persists as Christians grapple with contemporary issues like the theory of evolution, the interpretation of Scripture, and the role of science in our understanding of the world.
Johnson seems to suggest that both faith and reason are essential elements of the human experience, and that Christianity, at its best, attempts to hold them in creative tension, rather than demanding a rigid separation or a forced conformity.
Which brings us to a final, crucial question. How do we interpret and apply Christian teachings in a world that is constantly changing and increasingly diverse?
This has been a challenge for Christians from the very beginning. How do we take the teachings of Jesus, rooted in a specific time and place, and translate them into principles and practices that are relevant and meaningful for people across cultures and centuries?
We've seen a variety of approaches to this challenge throughout history. Some have emphasized a literal interpretation of Scripture, while others have sought to adapt Christian teachings to evolving social and cultural contexts. There have been those who have used Christianity to justify oppression and violence, and those who have drawn upon its principles to champion justice and equality.
The fact that Christianity has inspired such a wide range of interpretations and applications speaks to its richness and complexity. But it also makes it challenging to define a single, monolithic Christian perspective on any given issue.
And that's perhaps one of the most important takeaways from Johnson's book. Christianity is not a static or monolithic entity. It's a living tradition shaped by countless individuals, historical events, and cultural influences.
Which is why understanding the history of Christianity is so crucial. It helps us to understand the roots of our own beliefs and practices, to appreciate the diversity of Christian expression, and to engage in thoughtful and informed dialogue about the role of faith in our lives and in the world today.
If this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, we strongly encourage you to explore A History of Christianity by Paul Johnson for yourself. You can find a link to purchase the book in the episode description.
And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more explorations of fascinating books and ideas. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the history of Christianity. We look forward to diving into more thought-provoking topics with you in the future.